I'm a hybrid, complete hybrid, and I like hybridity, and that's why I like living in London, because it's a complete hybrid place. It's not just multicultural, but it's hybrid in its eclectic, stylistic approach, and that's why the Bartlett is an interesting place, I think, because it's not purist. And it's experimental, and I like experimentalism. I think architecture lives and survives of experimentalism. If it becomes too, reduced to the norms and dogmas that exist in architecture, then it won't evolve. And I like to live where the sources of ideas come from. And I grew up in a place and studied in a place which was at the end of the life of a river. And it was an original and creative place, and is an original place because of it. Porto is a very original architectural place because it's totally hybrid, but it's at the end of a river. And I like the beginnings of the river. I like where the sources of information and ideas come from. And I remember when I arrived, I read a small article which said that London is a place in the world where the largest amount of people gather together that go there because they want to meet other people. It's a networking platform. It's the biggest networking platform on earth. And it's not because people like the city or the weather is good, which is not, obviously, or where they earn most. It's because they want to meet people there. And I think I went there as a sponge. I was absorbent as a sponge, and therefore I met in my class my wife and my teaching and working partner in the same class. So can't be more of a sponge than at that time. I went to the Bartlett because I saw Peter giving a lecture in Barcelona in '93. And it was the most memorable moment in my life because I just thought, this guy is coming from another planet. And I just thought to myself at the time that I would love to have crossed the path of this man. I didn't know exactly where he was, but I just thought, there's something that he's talking about that just doesn't have anything to do with anybody I've met so far. And without predicting it at all, I mean, I spent quite a few years then still studying and then working until I got a sort of prospectus from the Bartlett, where there was this master's course of Peter Cook, and I thought, that's the course I want to do. So I did not know too much about archigram at the time, but what I, in hindsight, like about archigram, and why I think archigram is so exceptional, is that archigram was not afraid, as a movement, as a group of people, was not afraid to play with ideas that you could not realize. But they were also, one has to contextualize this, they were also part of a period where the conception of ideas, the visions, were very important. I think the big steps of architecture in the '70s are made through the visionary process. I think we are now in a period where we're more to do with production and actually the fabrication of things. We're more in a period of our history where the realization of things is more important than purely the conception. But still, archigram is amazing because it just liberates the process of thinking. But we as designers in a place like the Bartlett, we all do lateral design rather than lateral thinking. We find all sorts of bizarre ways to get somewhere in order to find a solution that is not a linear solution. And I think archigram they didn't call it lateral thinking or lateral design, but they did it all the time. Rather than talking about a table when they were supposed to design a table, they were talking about light, birds, the pink shirt of somebody to design a table. That's lateral thinking and lateral design. That means that the table at the end doesn't look like a normal table, obviously. It looks like something else. But it still works as a table. And I think a lot of what happened in the '70s still influences us nowadays. There has been an enormous amount of inventiveness that we haven't really sort of completely accomplished. And the other day we had a talk by a guy at the Bartlett who just talked about invention. And I thought, that's interesting, actually, challenging, because we haven't been using this word so much. We have been using more experimental, but not in inventiveness or invention. And the sheer validity of invention in architecture, I think, is pivotal. If we lose it, we're sort of stuck in the norms of what is being done. And Archigram was all about invention, obviously. And I'm not a minimalist in terms of style, neither in style nor in terms of approach, because I think there is not a strong idea in a project. There are many, many, many ideas. There's a multifaceted world of ideas that make great buildings be great buildings. Now, how to get there, how to do it, is something we don't have a recipe for. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of stuff that transcends us. And there's a lot of information that has to do with our complex minds, our internal hybridity, that takes a long time to intellectualize and to turn into instruments for design. And it's far too easy to sort of design something and have one idea or two ideas or three ideas, but it's much more difficult to be able to create a hierarchy and an intuitive balance of all these different issues that come together in a project and allow them to be there. And I think in terms of methodology, the most difficult aspect is to give students time to allow all this interference of thought and sensibilities to come into a project without having to select them out. And still have a clear hierarchy and still respond to a program and still to respond to all these issues that architects have to deal with, space and structure, etc. But to be able to have this absolutely fine-tuned, often difficult to explain issues that for the individuals are very important and the other ones don't understand. And they don't understand them at that moment, but later on they become really relevant. That's also why I think the English system that they have in the central London schools of portfolios is so essential, because portfolios are diaries more than anything else. They're large, complex diaries where a lot of information is documented, and a lot of information that at the time seems not relevant, but later on becomes incredibly important, and you refer to it all the time. You go back again to it all the time. That's the recycling process we do all the time. We are not mad people. We are intelligent beings where all this digestion of issues comes together. Something I'm going to mention in the lecture is that a lot of people have been talking about the liberating aspect of getting rid of typologies and just talking about topologies. And this is now sort of 10 years, 15 years old. So the liberation of the typology. I personally think that it's completely wrong to think that. It might have been useful at the moment for a person like Zaha Hadid or Greg Lynn to say that, but I think it's so not the right thing, because in fact what they introduced was that the topology became a typology of the surface. That's what it is. So it became a flattened typological thinking. And the traditional typology, which had to do with spatial organization and had to do with use and society, was sort of neglected as if it doesn't have any importance. And I think that's tragic, because architecture will evolve also on that level. And so in a way, if you think about all the logos that architecture has, it's a combination of these things. It's the ecology as much as the topology, the morphology, the typology. I would introduce another one, which I call the corpology, which has to do with concepts of people, of our body. And it's the combination of these that probably will make the big steps in architecture. No, don't ask me what it is going to look like, because I don't know. I do my best to try it. And the other day I had an interesting discussion with somebody where we were talking about where the big moments in history happen for architects. And in many respects, they had to do with changes of the society. They had also to do with changes in advances in technology, but the society mattered a lot. And for instance, one example we were discussing all the time was to do with the introduction of the corridor as a new typology in architecture. So if you go to the period prior to the 18th century, there were no corridors in buildings. And you think, no corridors, how on earth can they sort of circulate in a building? Well, they were circulating between rooms. And the word circulation did not exist. So buildings and architects and people did not circulate. They moved, or they behaved, or they chatted, or they slept, but they did not circulate. And the notion of circulation and the introduction of the corridor as a typology revolutionized completely the way in which we separated private and the public sphere, the way in which we started designing buildings, the way in which we organized them. And that had a major impact, an absolutely profound impact. And that's something that comes out of the need of a society which wants, a bourgeois society that wants to separate itself from the servants and wants to separate the private and public sphere in a very, very clear manner, but also introduce a level of efficiency that then the architects jump on the horse and say, gosh, that gives me an idea. What about, rather than having 3 rooms, put a corridor in the middle and link room number 1 with room number 3? I think a sense of zeitgeist is very important. That's my Germanic background that taught me that. I think to lose the sense of time, I think, is very dangerous. And I was always very, very afraid of waking up a few years later, looking back and thinking, shit, what I did was sort of dying slowly without noticing. I'm still very panicky about that. I hate that feeling. And I had it once or twice where I still was a student, I was doing things, I believed it profoundly, and then I met somebody else that said, oh, it's all very old. We are already doing something else, and you think, shit, was it a loss of time? Maybe it was a complete loss of time. You just spent a huge amount of energy doing the wrong thing. Wrong in terms of not what that meant for you, but what it meant to be part of a whole generation that is creating something. And I think that's a beautiful feeling to have, that you are constructing something. In any generation, any time, you're part of the evolution of what's happening. And I never liked to sit sort of in the back of the carriage when somebody was sort of riding the horses. I found it horrific. So in that sense, I think my advice is that to know what the new technologies are, to know what the new discussions are that are going on, I think is essential. If you lose that train, is a terrible feeling, because a few years later you look back and think, oh my God, I was in the wrong school, or I was talking about the wrong things. Now, having said that, I think this shows a certain level of anxiety, which I think one has to be careful with.